Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your attendance on such a warm day to this, the North Somerset Council Planning Regulatory Committee. My name is Councillor James Tonkin, and I'm the chairman of this committee, and may I welcome you to the meeting here at the Town Hall in Weston-super-Mare, which is being streamed live on YouTube, and a recording of which will be available on the Council website within the next 48 hours. I would like to introduce the officers who are here today. Head of Planning, Richard Kent. Strategic Development Service Managers, Simon Exley and Roger Wilmot. Senior Planning Officer, Jessica Smith. Lead Transport Planner, James Wigmore. And Sue Buck from our legal team, together with Hazel Brinton, our clerk, who is on MS Teams recording this event. I would like to thank them all for the effort they have put into enabling this meeting, and of course to Mike Riggle and his assistant for their help as well. Okay, at this point, I would like on behalf of the P&R committee to propose a vote of thanks to team manager Judith Porter, who is shortly to retire after 31 years working for the authority. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, members. Will you please ensure that all mobile phones are switched off or set to silent? I will now go to the agenda. Agenda item 1. We have...
Sorry, Chairman, can I just say something? I mean, 31 years is a long time. Is there a card going around that we can actually sign it or do something? That we can
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Didn't you? Shall I shout?
Yes.
I said 31 years seems a very long time, so I'm just wondering, lots of us have known her for a long time. Is there a card or something that's going around that we can sign?
We can certainly do that.
Yes, we would like to do that.
So, because of the circumstances, it's an electronic card.
That's all right.
So, yes, I can forward that to members with the link.
Please do. Yes, thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Anne. Okay. Right, move on to agenda item 1, public speaking. We have 3 speakers this afternoon, 2 in person and 1 written submission, which will be read out by Sue Buck. Please note, those who are speaking here, that you have 3 minutes in which to make your submission. First person is Mr. Dominic Anderson, who wishes to make representation in favour of the application 21P0803, the construction of the Scout headquarters at Wild Country Lane, Long Ashton. This submission will be read out by Sue Buck. Sue.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Dominic Anderson, Chairman of Long Ashton Scout Group Headquarters Committee. I'm addressing you this evening on behalf of everybody involved in the group, our active beavers, cubs, scouts and their families, the team of volunteers that make it happen, over 100 children and their parents and guardians hoping for the chance to join us. We would love to have been with you in person, but we understand and welcome the Council's desire to limit the risk of spreading coronavirus. The main thing I would like to convey is that after several years of searching, this proposal offers the best and most realistic chance for a future for scouting in Long Ashton. We're ready to work with officers to make it happen. I've been involved in the Scouts here for 10 years. The resurgence of interest and over the last 7 years shows no signs of shrinking. The steady stream of young families into the village is constant, particularly at the western end where the proposed site is close to a relatively high density housing. Our proposal is about meeting the needs of young people, giving kids wonderful opportunities as alternatives to staring at screens or hanging out on streets. There's a huge demand for the experiences Scouting offers and the unique way in which it prepares young people for their adult lives, leadership, team working, and upholding virtues such as respect and equality. We recognise the proposal has shortcomings and would like to work with the Council's officers to find solutions to mitigate them, establishing safe access for pedestrians, cyclists and cars, and mitigating any ecological impact. The results from our recent BAT survey indicate little impact. About 7 years ago, we had to move out of the existing headquarters, Since then, we have operated part-time out of the village primary schools, offering sessions restricted by space and facilities with no storage. We've worked patiently and thoroughly trying to find sites within the village. Sadly, there are none. We need 8 meetings per week. There are no existing facilities of a suitable size within the village that has that kind of spare capacity available to us, including the guides with whom we have a good relationship. Hope is now on the horizon. Following many years of hard work, we have a great opportunity for a new headquarters. On behalf of Long Ashton All Saints Scouts, I would therefore like to ask you to look favourably at this planning application for a new Scouts headquarters. It is so desperately needed by the village of Long Ashton. Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Anderson, for that, and thank you, Sue, for reading it out. I will now invite Dr. David Martin to speak to the application 20P/0861, erection of 14 dwellings to the east of Youngwood Lane, Nailsea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, everyone. The main concern of members at the June Committee regarding this proposal was that it infringes the strategic gap between Nailsea and Backwell. Core strategy CS19 states that the Council will protect strategic gaps to avoid incremental development damaging the separation of settlements. That risk is here highlighted by various landowners retaining residual commercial interest via the land registry for the surrounding fields, to which there are various means of access, including this site, Persimmon open land to the east, and Youngwood Lane to the west. This proposal is a test case for developments into strategic gaps either here or elsewhere. Developers will always try to circumvent protections just as they are doing here. Site Allocation Policy SA7 specifies that development within a strategic gap should be assessed against 3 criteria to avoid overriding harm. The defence of the present proposal rests mainly on the claim that it is small and not visually prominent. I contend that it fails all 3 criteria as follows. The first, much weight has been placed on the fact that the area of the site is only 1% of the strategic gap area. But how does discussing area address the approach towards coalescence of settlements? What you need to know is by how much the local gap would be narrowed. Satellite technology shows that the distance from the existing bungalows to the Nailsea-Backwell border across the gap would reduce by about 20%. Yes, some of the total gap is in Backwell. The distance from the existing bungalows to the nearest Backwell house across the gap would reduce by about 12%. Incremental narrowing on these scales is surely a significant adverse effect on the gap, failing the first criterion. The second, the proposed development does not form a smooth edge with existing sites in Nailsea, but is an isolated projection into the strategic gap pointing towards Backwell, harming their separation and the character of Nailsea's edge, thus failing the second criterion. None of the recently approved large sites in West Nailsea is adjacent to this site, as was wrongly illustrated at the June Committee. Third and last, in 2005, an application for just 9 bungalows on this site was rejected. The committee said, due to its prominent location on sloping land and the likely need to remove hedgerows, the proposals will be visually intrusive and have an adverse impact on the character of the landscape. This remains true for the present proposal, which requires the destruction of 2 parallel ancient mature hedgerows, including trees, totaling some 80 metres in length, severely harming the landscape, thus failing the third criterion. In conclusion, I believe the rejection of this application by the June Committee is eminently defensible, and I would urge you to uphold it. Once again, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I will now invite Mr. Jonathan Amos of Clifton Homes to speak in favour of the same application.
Good evening. My company is the applicant, I have lived and worked in North Somerset as far back as 1983. I do understand that neighbours are concerned at the prospect of development on their doorstep, but may I assure the committee that we are an approachable company, built to a high standard, and are a good neighbour. Addressing the key issues, there is a policy for small sites to be allowed on the edge of Nelsey for up to 50 homes outside the settlement boundary. We are proposing just 14. Surely developments located in hidden pockets around the edge of settlements are preferable to mass development. Secondly, contrary to public perception, you can build in the strategic gap, but any development must pass 3 very stringent tests. The proposal for this site does so on all 3 counts. How? This land is unique in that it is on the very edge of the gap. It is exceptionally well screened by high hedges and tall trees, which means it is not visible. There are limited, if any, views towards Backwell, and your landscape officer has raised no objection to the scheme. Concerns were raised about whether this application would lead to further development to the south. May I assure the committee this cannot happen. The road layout will not support more than 14 homes. Further, the land to the south is in separate ownership. It is protected by a wildlife area, and what appears to be a vacant plot in the southwest corner is public open space and sits above underground drainage equipment. It is not a point of future access. Turning to road safety, we have commissioned a road safety audit which concludes the highways arrangements are safe. This is also confirmed by the Council's highways officers. What are the benefits of this development? They include characterful eco-homes developed by a local company. 4 much-needed affordable homes. Bungalows are also there for the older purchaser. The frontage to the site provides part of the cycle link to the station, and not least, a new bus shelter on the Perrings. We understand that neighbours have voiced their concerns about the proposals, how officers have carefully considered our application and recommended its approval. In summary, this scheme before you is wholly compliant with planning policy, and we respectfully request that you vote in favour of these sensitive proposals, supporting your officers' recommendations and a local company. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Amos. That concludes public speaking. Agenda item 2. Apologies for absence and notification of substitution. Sue.
Chairman, the Assistant Director of Governance and Monitoring Officer has received the following apologies from Councillor Bryant, and the following substitutions are Councillor Hearn for Councillor Solomon, Councillor Bird for Councillor Bridger, and Councillor Cartman for Councillor Cherry.
Thank you, Sue. Agenda item 3, declaration of disclosable pecuniary interests. Are there any? No, thank you very much. Agenda item 4, minutes of the last meeting held on the 24th of June. I propose that I sign them as a correct record. Do I have a second? Thank you, Stuart. And all those in favour? Against? Any abstentions? No, thank you very much. That's carried. Matters referred by Council, the Executive or any other committee, sorry, agenda item 5. There are none as such, but I would mention that the Planning Peer Review Working Party's findings were debated at Council on Monday and approved for implementation as soon as possible. And I would like to thank Councillor Crockford-Hawley and all the officers for the efforts that they put into it. Thank you. Right, agenda item 6. Planning application 21P 0803, construction of a Scout headquarters and associated works at land to the west of Wild Country Lane, Long Ashton. This is a Section 1 application, and if members are minded to approve against officer recommendation, it will come back to a subsequent meeting for ratification. I will now invite Jessica Smith, the case officer, to outline the report of the Director of Police Directorate. Jessica.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to start by making members aware of the update sheet, where we've had an additional 47 comments in support of the application, the grounds of which are included within the update sheet. We've also had an amendment to the NPPF yesterday, which included a change to a paragraph in section 15 relating to enhancements to the natural environment. However, the change does not alter our assessment of the application. Yesterday, we also received an interim BAT survey from the applicant. The survey ensures that with correct mitigation, a biological net gain could be achieved at the site. However, we are still to receive other protected species surveys, including badger reports.
Apologies, the presentation is frozen. Let's just have a look.
Slight technical hitch. We'll have no singing.
Mike, I've just disconnected the laptop for the minute.
With bated breath, yeah.
All right, so this slide shows the application site outlined in blue at the bottom of the site, which is located to the west of Wild Country Lane. To the north is the west end of the Long Ashton settlement boundary. This is Western Road, and this is the location of the Guide HQ. This shows the site location plan. The site is outlined in red, with all other land owned by the current occupier outlined in blue, and this is all currently agricultural land. This slide shows the site layout plan, including the proposed landscaping. The proposed building is located to the north, with a new access to the south. There would be parking in between, and there's a proposed native hedgerow to run along the western and southern boundaries to be retained at 1.2 meters. There are also trees to be planted across the site. This is a proposed site plan, again without the detailed landscaping. The proposed access would be shared between vehicle and a public right-of-way that's currently existing. The access would run northwards with the parking in between the building and the access. There would be 13 vehicle parking spaces. The access and parking spaces would all be finished in tarmac. This is the proposed floor plan for the building that includes a hall, an activity and meeting room, a kit store, a hall store, kitchen and WC facilities. On the outside, there's a decking running along the southern and western side building boundaries. The proposed building is single-story in height and is approximately 22.6 meters in length, 15.5 meters in width, and 7.12 meters in height. It's proposed to be finished in timber vertical cladding with a metal-cladded roof. These are photos included with the submitted design and access statement. The top left photo shows the application site to the left-hand side with the existing gated access, as well as the footpath running adjacent to the application site, and this is a northward view towards Long Ashton. The top right photo and bottom photo are photos taken from within the application site showing the agricultural land. This photo is taken from the proposed access. This shows the existing visibility to the north of the application site. It also shows the existing footpath opposite the application site, as well as the last street light, which is erected to the electric pole. This is taken from the opposite side of the application site, again looking northwards towards Long Ashton. This is the existing access, which is proposed to be closed as part of the proposal. Again, this is the existing street light with the footpath, and in the distance beyond the car is where the 30-mile-per-hour zone starts. This is a photo looking southwards with the application site and existing access to the right. The proposed access would be located where the vehicle is currently parked, and this would be the footpath that would serve the application site. And this is a photo of the southern visibility display from the proposed access. The committee report includes all the issues with the application, and the application is being recommended for refusal for 5 different reasons. Following the update sheet and changes to the NPPF, no changes have been made to the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And it had to be on your first presentation, didn't it? Never mind. Okay, thank you. I'll now invite Councillor Ashley Cartman, who is the ward member, to speak and offer a proposal. Ashley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jessica. That was really good. Thank you, and thank you for all your hard work on this. I know we've spoken a few times, so it's been really very helpful. And thank you to the rest of the team. I'd also like to thank the Chair and the Vice Chair as well, because they've been quite helpful in terms of deciding how to bring this forward to the committee for your consideration today. And I've also been talking to the Scouts, who did desperately want to be here today, but followed the guidance of officers and decided to submit a written statement instead. This has been a long time coming. It's been years and years this has been worked on, and this is not just Stuart and I bringing this. I know my predecessor, our predecessor Charles Kay, has been working on it. The parish council have been working on it for a number of years, looking for a site and working with the Scouts, because there's a severe shortage of provision for space in the community. You'll see reference to the guide hut there. There's reasons why that's not applicable, which will come to it. I think it's amazing the level of support it's got, and we all get emails for and against planning applications. I've just totted up with the latest figures that Jessica has. 182 comments and only 1 objection, and that's publicly. And I can say broadly, I'm getting no objections personally on my email, which, as we know, as ward members, if people are unwilling to share things publicly, they often contact you personally. I'm not finding that. I'm not finding that at all. So it's an amazing community facility. It's got very high environmental credentials. It's universally popular in the community. And this is why I think Stuart and I felt it was really proper that it comes to this committee for consideration. The report's very detailed and technical, which is what you'd expect, perhaps more so than I originally thought in terms of the complications of the matters that we have to deal with. It identifies 8 principal planning issues and 5 reasons, as we've heard, for refusal, and an inordinate number of references to planning policies and law. It's very complicated indeed. But for me, I've put the concerns in the report into 3 boxes or headings to make it simple for us all to kind of grasp. One is the principle of developing on the site itself. Let's not remember, this is in the green belt, so it's very emotive for everyone in North Somerset, and particularly residents in Long Ashton, because we are on the edge of Bristol, as you know. Secondly is issues around highways and safety, and they're also important. And thirdly, there's a number of issues and matters and conditions in the report that I think need to be discussed. These are items that perhaps need further work, and I was pleased in the statement from the Scouts that they're willing to work with officers to kind of see resolution of those issues. And I can assure you that in my dealings with them, they are always very keen to move forward and compromise and find a practical way forward. I'll deal briefly with each of them in turn. I don't want to speak for too long because you've read the report. But essentially what I'm going to be looking to do, proposing and then Stuart seconding, is propose a motion that seeks to establish the principle of development. And that's really what we're looking at today, because we understand there are a number of complicated issues here, but we don't want to move forward if the committee is actually against the idea of anything ever in this location for the Scouts. And I think that's where we're coming from. If we can establish that today, it gives us a basis of working with officers to move forward and, if appropriate, come back to this committee if they feel there are suitable concerns and matters outstanding. I think let's start with the location then. I think that again, it comes back to the green belt, and I think the first line of defence on the green belt is it has to satisfy some of the requirements for recreational facilities. And I think up in Long Ashton we have a rather unique perspective on this. We are surrounded by Bristol City Football Club, Bristol Bears, and a number of private schools with private sports grounds, none of which can be accessed by the general public and residents of Long Ashton. Now, we understand how they meet the green belt. It is frustrating for us that a scout hut with outdoor recreational space, which seems to meet the spirit of the legislation or not the technical aspect of it, does not meet those requirements. And I have to admit, I probably broadly agree with the officer's view on that they don't. And that's a sad situation that we are in. But that's what this committee is about, isn't it? Possibly about thinking, is that actually the right thing? I think in terms of the other aspects of the location, there's 3 issues in the report. It talks about inappropriate development in the greenbelt, the principle of community use in this location, and the landscape impact. And I'll deal with those in one, if I may. I think the report it portrays the development as a rather large building in open countryside. And I think the phrase I picked out, and it's always rather unfair to officers to pick out one sentence, but I'm going to do it anyway. However, the proposed building would be large and visually intrusive within the greenbelt. And I have to admit, I disagree with that. I mean, it is a big building. But if you know the road as I do, when you approach it from the village, you wouldn't even see it when you were passing. Approaching it from the other way, you would. But I think you've seen the designs up on the screens. I think those designs are sensitive and they would fit in with the rural setting. It is open in one way, and I think the only aspect where you'd say a building such as that does have harm would be for walkers. I don't think there's any harm in terms of the wider visual impact of the greenbelt, but I think for us that is a price worth paying for us as a community, which brings me to my next point really, which is about the very special circumstances, and that approval I believe can be given in very special circumstances. And I believe we do meet that reason. I think that, we listed in the report, I won't list them out, but a number of different reasons why we feel that this is a very beneficial to our community, and I think the report slightly over-assesses the so-called harm. And I think that's important to note, because ultimately it is a community facility, and if a community such as Long Ashton assess the harm to the greenbelt is acceptable when we're on the edge of Bristol, I think that deserves to be heard. Other kind of comments in terms of its location, if you've read the report, there'll be, again, rather unfairly, I'll say it gives the impression it's in the middle of nowhere. It's not. It's 250 metres, as the report says, from a road called Perry Road. 250 metres is probably less than anyone in this committee has walked to get into this building from their car. It's probably not much further than the length of the town hall. So it's not actually that far. And what is Perry Road? Perry Road's on a national cycle route. It's built for sustainable transport. Of course, then you do have the concern of how do people get from that national cycle route to where they are. And there are problems, I accept that, but let's not forget there is a pathway. There are street lights. They could be better, but they do exist, and they are adequate in my view. But we can talk about as a committee whether we feel they should be improved further. So I think it is accessible and it is sustainable. Yes, it might be better if it had been on the guide hut site, but the guides say that's not big enough and they're not willing to play anyway, so we haven't got much choice there. I think the biggest thing I agree with in this report is on highways. I do think there are concerns we need to take away, and I'll be putting that in the motion I'll talk to you in a minute. The 30-mile-an-hour zone is of concern. If children and volunteers are approaching that and crossing the road, we clearly don't want cars doing 50 miles an hour. The reality of me driving down that road is I never do 50 miles an hour around that bend, not even 40. So I think we could look at, if members were minded, to looking at speed surveys and perhaps working with our highways department to to take the speed limit further out to address some of these concerns. But that's part of a wider programme of action that I think needs to come out of this to address the valid concerns raised in this report around safety for people accessing the site. I think in terms of my final thing, if first was about the location, secondly about highways, and third's about the outstanding matters, I'm pleased that the BAT survey's come back, and pleased that it says there could be a net gain, which is always a really good thing to have. I note in the report that they've talked about the sustainability of the building again, which is very positive. I think we need to put some condition in to say that those reports need to be finalised before any approval is given. I notice there's conditions in the report also about drainage and heritage and archaeological findings, and I think they would be fine to attach as well. And I think the final one that I'd like to do is a Section 106 agreement. I know this is not mentioned in the report, but I am learning as I'm becoming a councillor about planning, and I'm aware here that you have the Scouts, you have an independent landowner, and you obviously have us. And I think we would be neglecting our duty not to put into a Section 106 agreement that said planning is only given once the Scouts have taken possession of the land. I think the landowner has been very community-minded in offering this land, but I think it's still an important part of our duty to protect the interests from any other kind of development. So in terms of the motion then, I will read this out now in terms of what I propose. So the committee approves this application subject to resolution of the following outstanding matters: submission of the required ecological reports, plans of the proposed pedestrian access and determination of the vehicle access point, including speeds, an agreement of a suitable 106 agreement between the Scouts, the landowner, and North Somerset Council. Planning conditions relating to these issues based on information received being acceptable, as well as conditions noted in the report relating to non-designated heritage assets and drainage, will be attached to any permission given. The Chair of Planning and Regulatory Committee, in consultation with appropriate officers, will make the decision whether or not the application can be approved under delegated authority or should be referred back to this committee for final approval. And I take the point that will probably need amending slightly because it's a Section 1 item anyway and automatically comes back. But the point being is to give the ability of this committee to bring it back more fully to discuss specific items. I think finally, in concluding, I kind of reflecting on the purpose of this committee. I'm one of the 13 who dropped when COVID came in. And I think my experience of it's a technical committee in terms of the advice received from officers. But the question is, why are we here? Because there is absolutely no way we will have any greater technical expertise than the officers before us. And if that's not what we're here for, and we're not professional planners, and we can debate this or that policy, reference this law or that, but at the end of the day, we are amateurs. But our role is important, and too often we think, or I think of this committee, is to block, it is to prevent, and it is to frustrate. But the real power of this committee is not to refuse, it is to give. To grant permission where the community need and desire is more important than the national planning law. To give back something to our communities. We are all local, and I hate this word politicians, because none of us think of us like that, and we represent our community in the face of these national laws. My view is the very fact that we have been given this power to approve this application if we so see fit is a recognition that not all local situations can be covered by a national framework. And this application, to me, is the perfect example of when we should exercise that power, when the cumbersome national framework cannot take account of the specific local circumstances. This is tremendously popular in the local community, something that is desperately needed for our young people and would hopefully last for years and benefit generations and generations. And I would hope and urge that you support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ashley. Does that motion find a seconder? Stuart, do you wish to speak to the
Yes,
proposal?
please, Chair, if that's acceptable. I will not go over all the same points, but I am happy to reinforce a few. I'm very happy to second this motion from Councillor Cartman. I remember being sat in a parish council meeting 6-7 years ago when the Scouts first came to us looking for a home and were assisted by the parish council and the then ward councillor, Councillor Charles Cave. I know that he and other members of the community have worked closely with the councillor Parish Council and the Scouts over the years to identify and gradually rule out various locations. Various different landowners have been approached and areas of land ruled out due to cost, infeasibility or lack of space. I do feel it's a little bit inappropriate for us to decide that whether the guides have appropriate room. The guides have made a clear space. They do not have that space, and I think we should trust that the guides understand their business. So that's one area where I do slightly disagree with the officer. On the issue of Greenbelt, like my colleague, I do very much understand that the value that Long Ashton residents in particular attach to the Greenbelt. It's very much what stops us from being absorbed into Bristol. I say that as a Bristolian. I have nothing against Bristol, but Long Ashton residents do not want to become part of that urban configuration. Thank you very much. I believe this is, as Ashley has said, an exceptional case where the benefits of the community outweigh the harm. I also believe the harm is a little overstated in the report. Bear in mind, some reports have not yet been received. There are, however, some issues that need to be resolved, as Ashley has already alluded to. And I completely support Ashley's point around the sports fields, and it does feel like there's a little bit of a, I wouldn't say the word loophole, but there needs to be some clarification in national policy there, because it says some sorts of outdoor activities are encouraged and other forms of outdoor activities are not. So turning to the outstanding issues, road safety and pedestrian access, completely agree. I read the report. I share a lot of the concerns of the officer. The difference is I feel that, as Ashley's outlined, we should agree the principle of development and then work together to resolve these issues. The particular issue for me is around pedestrian and cycle safety. It's close to a cycle path and a pedestrian access, but I think there's room for improvement, and I know the Scouts will work hard to produce the necessary information, and I'm absolutely confident that the solution can be found there, hence my support for this motion. And as others have already noted, we've had one ecological report due already suggesting that there's no predicted impact on bats, and actually notes that the expanded hedgerows may in time improve the situation, and I applaud the Scouts for their approach to biodiversity in general. I am confident that the Scouts and other parties can work together to resolve this complicated application, and that it represents a really important asset for the community if approved, and I commend the motion to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Stuart. Before I open it up for debate, I'm going to pass the mantle over to Richard Kent, who wants to say a few words.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'll perhaps ask Jessica Smith to comment on the Greenbelt policy in a second, and James Wigmore to just make an observation on the highway points. But I just wanted to reflect on what Councillor Cartman said about the role of the committee. And I think the important point, and I'm sure members do get this, that ultimately the role of the committee is to make sound planning decisions based on planning law, policy, procedure. It's not a referendum. Obviously, we do get lots of comments both for and against applications, but as you'll know, it's the planning merits that matter, not the volume of objection or support in their own right. In terms of the development plan, those policies are set out in the report. It is in the Greenbelt, and it falls within the definition of inappropriate development, which should only be granted if there are very special circumstances. Reference was made to sites like Bristol Bears and Bristol City Football Club, and they did go through that very special circumstances test. It is open to the committee to come to a decision based on very special circumstances, and obviously there is reference there in the committee report. But perhaps I'll just ask Jessica just to explain a little bit more about that, and then on to James about the highway matters, if that's okay.
Thank you. Jessica.
Thank you, Chairman. So with applications for recreational facilities, they do not constitute inappropriate development, as we've heard. And the material change of use of land does constitute inappropriate development. So when a development is inappropriate development, we then have to look at the harm caused to the openness of the Greenbelt, which includes both visual and spatial harm. Due to the scale and location of the application site, this is therefore considered to be harmful. So this is why the application is considered to be inappropriate development that is harmful to the Greenbelt and the reason for including land within it. We then move on to the very special circumstances. We have had a couple of appeal decisions submitted in support of this application where they have outlined some issues and also circumstances under very special circumstances. Unfortunately, in this case, the application site is not surrounded by any other development, as were the applications in the appeals, and we therefore have not found that the very special circumstances put forward to us as listed in the report do actually outweigh the harm to the openness of the greenbelt.
Thank you, Jessica. James, would you like to speak?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, first of all, I just want to remind members about her latest government policy about active travel first, so pedestrians, cyclists before vehicles. So obviously the key for highways and transport is to ensure safe pedestrian access and safe cycle and vehicle access to the site. And this can't be an afterthought, it does need to be designed in from the beginning. And young people are considered vulnerable road users, so it's even more sensitive because of the users of the facility. And it's just really to underline that there may be some additional requirements that may be needed, mitigations, and these will be dependent on the vehicle speed surveys, which will inform what the access needs to look like as far as visibility. And it will, depending on those, speed reduction measures may or may not be required. So and that will require works on the highway, and that will be something that the applicant will need to sort of carry out themselves under permission from the council. So what we're not saying is safe access can't be achieved. It's highly likely safe access can be achieved, but there are various mitigations that may be required which have financial implications, and that's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Right, I'll open it up now for debate. Councillor Harley.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I can understand exactly the policies and everything that you're saying, but I do agree with Councillor Cartman that sometimes we've just got to look at our community, and I would go over several of the other things that they've commented on, but I don't think we want to go over it again. I would just like to say, obviously, Charles Cave's name was mentioned, and he actually contacted some of us because he still feels so passionately about it. And for an ex-councillor to carry on like that, it obviously means such a lot to him and to the parish council and the people that he dealt with at that time. My concern is, actually, one of my concerns is, I think the Scouts are a wonderful, wonderful group and do such a lot of good. And unfortunately, in my ward, we've lost 2 Scout troops because they've got no facilities to meet. And this is an opportunity, I think, to get these young people in to an environment, get them out, build their characters, take them out into the community, take them into the issues that we are and they've got to live with in the future, and to actually sort of say, well, I'm sorry, but you know it's in a green belt, however important that is, because probably 2 or 3 years down the line, the green belt won't mean very much, because we will have all gone through it, I should think. And I really feel that an offer has been made there with the motion, etc., to work to try and achieve this. And I think we've got to really think about our young people, because it's a horrible expression, but it maketh the man. They come in, they're very young. Some of them come from poor homes, and they get that sort of character building. And there's nothing out in the community that does that for them but the Scouts. And I have such a high regard from them. I can understand probably the girl guys don't want the Scouts in there, but if I'd been a girl guide, I would like the Scouts there, but still, that's just me. But I think the thing is that, you know, I totally support what you're trying to do, and I think, you know, good luck to you, and I should be supporting you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anne. Are there any other speakers? Councillor Crockford-Hawley.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got 2 hats I'm wearing tonight. As your Vice Chairman, I have every regard for the planning regulations under which we work and operate. And I'm also President of the Axe District Scouts. But that's not the Gordano group. So there's some terrible playback on this. Chairman, I think there are, as far as I can see, there are really two critical aspects. There are the technical issues which are there to be argued technically, but the reference to very special circumstances, which is the only way in which we can justifiably break the green belt rule, is itself a very difficult matter, isn't it? It's sorry, I'm getting a great deal of playback on. Right. I can't hear a thing now, but you can hear me. IT people, sort that out. It's very embarrassing. The very special circumstances strikes me as being the only reason we have for countering the officer's legitimate argument that we should refuse it. And when we argue very special circumstances, I'm not quite sure of the technicality of that, because what is a special circumstance to one person may not be to another person. And the mere fact that we're talking about very special circumstances makes it even more philosophical to me rather than technical. And I am very minded to support the fact that this is a special circumstance, and further than that, it is a very special circumstance, and therefore we would be quite justified in using the exceptional need element to go contrary to our Greenbelt policy. Having said that, I think it is absolutely critical, and I'm glad Ash has mentioned this, that we have a Section 106 agreement, because the last thing I would want to see is this committee granting planning permission for the whole land acquisition to fall out, and for the farmer then to retain a piece of land with an outline planning permission. That would be disastrous. So if we can tie it up legally, I'm minded not to support my officers, but to vote against them on this and to support the members for that ward in their proposition. Difficult, but I do think it is a very special circumstance which allows us to make an exceptional needs variation to the Greenbelt policy. May I switch this off now and put my hearing aids back in?
Yes, please. Thank you, John. Councillor Payne.
Thank you, Chairman. It was a very good proposal from Councillor Cartman, and I'm pleased that that he's proposed it in that way, because there are some issues with this application, and there are outstanding matters which need to be addressed. But it is frustrating to me that we do seem to be using the inflexibility of Greenbelt policies to thwart what would be a positive and beneficial new community facility. I mean, if you look at CS6 and the general Greenbelt policies, there's no way that this development would have any effect on the boundaries of Bristol. It would not create urban sprawl, which is what Greenbelt policy is supposed to be doing. And if we look at DM12, the material change of use, it is pretty vague, and it says that it's got to maintain the openness of the green belt, and it mustn't conflict with other uses around it. Well, I would say that's pretty subjective, but for me, I don't think it does that at all. So I'm quite happy with the principle of development on this site. I would say that the Scouts do encourage the positive recreation, outdoor activity, which we ought to be promoting. And so for me, the benefits clearly outweigh the harm. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Does anybody else wish to speak? Councillor Crew.
You missed me, Chairman. Following on from what Councillor Crawford-Hall has said, I think we have to be realistic. We have regular meetings on different things, different aspects of what we're going to do, recognising the fact that in some instances we will have to encroach around villages on some of the green belt. It doesn't mean to say we're opening up the green belt. I would guess this was a very fine line for officers because although paragraph 143, 144 says it needs special circumstances, I think this is perfectly acceptable in the location it's at. I can't see a problem. I was up there at the weekend looking at it. I really can't see a problem there. And then when I sit down on other working groups, I find that we're talking all the time about quiet lanes, where we're blanketly introducing or suggested we introduce 20-mile-an-hour zones without consultation, and we had to scrap it, and we've gone back another way. This, to me, is perfectly straightforward. If this application went through, and yes, there was a concern, it's an exact one, as it's already a cycle lane, for a 20-mile-an-hour quiet road. I completely support what Councillor Cartman said, although I would have gone the other way and actually proposed approval straight off. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Westwood.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with the immediate previous speaker. The one thing that I was very pleased that Councillor Cartman brought up was the problem with the roads. If an accident can happen and there is national speed limit on that stretch of road, then somebody will bowl along there just at the national speed limit at some point, and there could well be, well, you know, this scenario with children in the mix. There you go. So what I would say is that I think we need to deal with this, as Councillor Crew has just said. We can't give an outline or a provisional approval. We either approve it now and put in conditions and comments as to what we think should do, and hopefully, you know, the applicants in consultation with the local members and the committee chair can sort out the details. And pretty much that's all I've got to say. So there you go.
Thank you, Richard. Richard Kent.
Thanks, Chairman. I think that's been very helpful because members are talking in terms of very special circumstances, which is the test that we have to apply. And I think that's what I meant at the beginning about applying the thought process in the appropriate way rather than just simply talking about the number of people for and against and so on. I think from what I've heard, the very special circumstances that are being advanced are those that are in the report. As set out, Councillor Cartman referred to them, and that seems to cover the points that are being made. And I think I would urge that the motion is worded just to include the fact that the committee considers there are very special circumstances as set out, and you're approving it on that basis, subject to the clarification of pedestrian access and so on in the Section 106 agreement, and then the conditions. So I think if the motion were to include the reference to very special circumstances, I think that would be important. Clearly, as was said at the beginning, it is a Section 1 item, so it would need to come back if the resolution is contrary to officer recommendation in any event. So I think it knits together quite well.
Thank you, Richard. Are there any other speakers? No. Ashley, would you like to sum up, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone, for your comment. Thank you, Richard, for those final comments. I think it does come down to the very special circumstances, as we've talked about, and I think that the balance and the judgment ultimately that's been drawn, I think, is not quite right in my mind. I think we've over-assessed the damage to the greenbelt here and under-assessed the benefits, and I think some of the things in the report around sustainability, I do think it's a reasonably sustainable site given its location, and I appreciate that, for example, we've talked about other locations, but that's because officers haven't been able to have proof that this council have considered those, but Stuart and I know from living there that they have. So I think when you factor all that in, I think, yeah, I'm happy to take the recommendation that the motion's amended to say the committee approves this application, perhaps under very special circumstances, or I don't know how you'd would propose we word that. But I do think we should then, if the committee is minded to retain the fact that we do want further work on the highways elements, that we are very concerned about that, and that we will only grant the permission if they can be resolved to the satisfaction of officers, and if everyone's okay, the chair of P&R and deputy or something, and if they feel that it's contentious, they can always bring it back here. And then, of course, as the original motion said, to incorporate all the other conditions around ecology reports, heritage assets, etc., etc.
And the section 106.
And the section 106, which is true. So again, this is rather a strange one, isn't it? Because the landowner is being very community-minded, and we're kind of saying we just want to make sure you are. I think is the way to put it. But he might change. It might sell his land to someone else, yes, so, or she. So I think, yeah, I don't know the landowner. So thank you for that.
We'll have to come back with the 106 agreement.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Stuart, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I thank the committee for the support given, and I thank Richard for his comments on very special circumstances. I think that clarifies the motion very well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Stuart. Right. We go to the vote. In that case, the proposal is to go against officer recommendation and approve the application subject to the conditions that have been put out so far. As Richard and I have already said, this is a Section 1 application, so it will sit or lie for one cycle and come back at the next meeting. Okay, all those in favour? It's unanimous. Thank you. Carried. Okay. Thank you all very much. We go on to agenda item 7. Oh, right, yes, okay. Swap round. I hope you have better luck, Roger, with it. Okay. Right, planning application 20/P/0861, erection of 14 dwellings, provision for access, public open space, drainage, landscaping and ancillary works at land to the east of Youngwood Lane, Nailsea. This is a Section 2 report. I will now invite Roger Wilmot to outline the report of the Director of the Police Directorate. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll just run quickly through the presentation slides again, just as a reminder of the proposal. So the site is off the pairings. It's the site outlined in red on this plan. I think you're probably fairly familiar with that now, so I'll move on. Just to ensure that everybody's clear in their minds, and I think that perhaps I was guilty last meeting of not clarifying that sufficiently, but just to indicate the site is this one arrowed here, so I've done slightly crude outlines on it, but that's the site there. I referred to other developments in the vicinity, so we've got the Uplands one, which is broadly signified by the star there, and the Youngwood Lane proposal, the eastern boundary of which is this one here. This is the layout plan, just as a reminder. Again, I probably won't dwell on this, but it shows the 14 dwellings ranged with the access coming off the pairings, a number of those dwellings on the north side with some bungalows in the initial plots. And this is a proposal which involves affordable housing as well. Down at the bottom corner of the site, you'll see the one of the areas of open space that's been referred to. Likewise, at the entrance to the site here, there's another area of proposed open space. And along the perimeter boundaries, it shows the retention of hedging and a 5-metre biodiversity corridor being provided along there. Just to pick up on one of the matters that's been referred to, which was the potential for this site to give access to adjacent development or potentially adjacent development to the south of this site. I think you've already seen within the report reference to the road width and the nature of the access road and the inability of that to satisfy standards to accommodate more than the 14 dwellings proposed. But on this particular detail, what this also shows is that you'll see the part of the turning head here. The turning head itself is necessary to ensure that refuse vehicles can access the development and emerge again in forward gear. But in addition to that, there is a proposed private pumping station down at the bottom with private soakaway and a soakaway specifically for the surface water off the highways. Now, we've clarified that point. The applicant has said that it's not possible to develop or plant trees over the top of that. We've confirmed that with our flood risk officer, and that is the case. On this plan, you'll also see just some blue squiggles, as it were, just in various areas. And those are some additional areas which the applicant has suggested that they can probably do some further wildflower meadow areas to accommodate the wishes of Natural England for biodiversity. Again, just briefly, this is a slightly larger scale version of, just to give you an impression of the house types that are proposed on here. We considered that these were a good quality of design and I think are fairly attractive in their own right. Just an indication as well of the fact that some of the site will be cut into the existing slope, so you get this sort of cross-sectional detail. You can see the bungalows at the entrance to the site here, and further on this develops into the housing, which some of which is further down the site on the slope. Just to illustrate the point, there was a lot of concern, I think, about the strategic gap and the impact of this application on it. So the area of the strategic gap is shown in brown here, with the application site which would be removed from the strategic gap, this area here. Now we've measured the strategic gap and that amounts to something in the region of 64 hectares. The proposed site of the development would effectively remove approximately 1.2% of the strategic gap. And I think it's fairly easy to see from this the sort of level of impact that we believe that has on the strategic gap. And as I say, from the report, you'll gauge that we felt that that was a very limited effect. It was very difficult to demonstrate a tangible impact on the strategic gap arising from this. Just for reference point, this is the, so we've got the application site. This is the area which the Town Council have proposed for town and village green status. We also show on this particular plan not just part of the strategic gap, but also the areas that are proposed in the Sites and Policies Plan as local amenity space. You'll see the application site here, and there is a very small section. I think it amounts to probably something like 0.75 percentage point from the total area of local amenity space. And just by way of providing further context, the area coloured blue on this particular plan shows area defined as nature space, and from that point of view, again, I think it makes any further expansion of land to the south to be a very difficult one to actually make. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. The site is just here. So effectively the nature site is on the southern boundary of that. Okay. Just come back to the site. If I can just run very briefly through the update sheet and a couple of further comments that may help you in your deliberations on this. So on the update sheet, we've referred to some additional information from the applicant. I've already just run through that in connection with the drainage infrastructure and the comments from the Council's flood risk manager. There's some additional comments from Natural England there, and we are sort of exploring the creation of some additional habitat units, which I referred to on this slide, which were these areas here where some potential for additional meadow grass planting may be possible. Our recommendation is for still for approval with the additional requirement of trying to secure some changes around these areas. We've also can confirm that it's possible, I think, within the terms of a Section 106 agreement to reaching an agreement with the applicant that there will be no access provided through the site to land to the south, either for roads, paths or services. So I think that provides some additional assurance about this site effectively being just the first of a series of developments to the south. We have proposed 2 additional conditions. Those are in response to Natural England's requirements. So effectively they are to require the ecological mitigation measures to be implemented in particular in accordance with the timetable required by Natural England, because they'd like to see the additional planting taking place at a very early stage. And then a proposed condition 14, which would require the landscape and ecological management of the open spaces on the site. Just very briefly, just to sort of say that we've had a further look in terms of the strategic gap, and I think that we've indicated the 3 criteria which have to be satisfied in order to be able to develop in the strategic gap, and we've explained in the committee agenda papers why we felt that those criteria were met. I think it's fair to say that in terms of the receptors, as it were, of the strategic gap, which could be drivers, cyclists and walkers as well, I think that they will continue to experience the sense of leaving one settlement, i.e. Nailsea, and passing through a distinctly different space, for example, the open countryside between the settlements, before reaching another distinctly different settlement, in this case, Backwell. And I think that will remain the case on the Perrings Station Road at Nailsea and Backwell Common. And we've looked at those issues of the potential for impacts arising from this combined with other developments. We've looked at the potential for impacts with simultaneous developments, but there aren't actively any significant simultaneous developments at the present moment. And we've looked at the combined effects from the same development. So we've looked at the issues of harm to biodiversity, which that we acknowledge there is some, but as you all have gathered from Natural England, those are adequately mitigated for. And we've looked at the landscape impact, and as we previously explained, I think we feel that this site is quite self-contained in that way. So I think there is a particular point about our ability to actually articulate any actual harm arising from the proposed development. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Roger. Richard.
Chairman, yes, just very quickly, a point that's made in the report, which we just need to emphasise, is that development on the edge of the settlement of this sort of scale is acceptable in principle under the core strategy. So there is, in principle, the development on the edge of the settlement, the edge of a town of up to 50 is acceptable in policy terms. You then have to weigh into the balance that we don't have a 5-year housing supply. So that means that the need for housing carries greater weight. Therefore, you have to be able to show that the impacts of the development demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the additional housing. And in that respect, quite often in this chamber, there's criticism of the fact we have too much volume house building, too many standard house types. This is a small site with a local builder, as Roger said, a quality design, providing affordable housing. So that's all things that we should weigh in the balance as well. And just be really clear that the concern about future development to the south is not something that you should give any weight to. Roger's explained why technically that's unlikely because of the way this site is being proposed to be built and serviced in that particular corner. But in any event, you can deal with developments on other sites on its merits when and if that proposal comes forward. Hopefully that guidance is clear, Chairman.
Thank you, Richard. I'm now going to invite Councillor Sandra Hearn, who's the ward member, to speak and offer a proposal, hopefully. Sandra.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, everybody. Right, I originally called this application into committee in April, which was some time ago, and at that meeting it was decided a site visit was needed. There was no meeting in May, so for various reasons. And last month, Councillor Cole actually stood in for me to bring this. It's all to do with the strategic gap. I know on the map it looks very small, but you can see the area of the field as it is now from other parts as you travel into Nailsea. And not just up Bucklands Batch and Station Road, but across other lanes and what have you. So it is down to that. With having called this in April, there have been a lot of meetings between the developers and the officers. So some things have changed, but that one issue has not changed because we have had it to do with the road access and pavement and what have you. Those have been sorted and the design is good. As it was pointed out, we've had a lot of problems, but it is that strategic gap problem that we have, and it's not going to go away. If we let this one go, what else will happen anywhere else? So the proposed development lies within the strategic gap, where the proposed development would harm the open space and undeveloped character of the area, resulting in incremental erosion of the gap separating Nailsea and Backwell and the landscape setting of Nailsea, contrary to policy CS19 of the core strategy and policy SA7 of the site allocation plan. And I don't think anything has changed.
So can you offer a proposal as such, please?
As I said in my last, the proposed development lies within the strategic gap, where the proposed development would harm the open and developed character of the area, resulting in incremental erosion of the gap separating Nailsea and Backwell and the landscape setting of Nailsea, contrary to policy CS19 of the core strategy and policy SA7 of the site allocation plan.
Thank you, Sandra. Does that find a seconder? Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Chairman. The application was refused at the last planning meeting because of the detrimental impact on the strategic gap. Approval of the application opens up the door to other plan applications within the gap in the future via numerous access points. Large house builders will be waiting in the wings, awaiting the outcome of today's determination with interest. Planning policies CS19 and SA7 support the retention of the gap as important green spaces. In particular, they protect town and village separate identities and also preserve character and landscape settings between settlements. I believe there are no special reasons or circumstances which allow development in the gap. There are no guarantees from officers that will prevent other speculative planning applications in the gap, which is at odds with the Council's principle of protecting the gap, which is enshrined in the adopted core strategy. Suggestions that the Perrings application is in close proximity to other development sites at Youngwood Lane, Engine Lane and the Uplands are misleading and incorrect. So, to summarise, I believe the proposal compromises the acknowledged gap and is contrary to the North Somerset core strategy, and the proposal is contrary to planning policies CS19 and SA7, which seek to protect and preserve strategic gaps to retain separate identities and protect landscapes. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Andy. Open it up for debate now. Councillor Crockford-Hawley.
So, if I understand the wording of the proposition correctly, it is relying on one reason for refusal, and that is encroachment on the strategic gap. But that, as we have heard from the officers, would be probably indefensible. So as much as one might sympathise with the idea that a small proportion of the strategic gap is going to be affected adversely, that in itself would not be sufficient grounds for refusing the application. And therefore, I can see no alternative other than granting permission as officers have recommended. And having said that, those of us who were at council on Monday will have heard when I made my comments about the volume house builders. This is absolutely the opposite of that, and something to be welcomed. It is a rather attractive layout, rather attractive design, and perhaps these smaller scale developments are the sorts of things we ought to be encouraging. So as much as I sympathise with the local members, I think you're on very thin ice if that's your only reason for refusing it.
Thank you, John. Councillor Cartman.
Thank you, Chair. This does come down to the strategic gap to me. Although I applaud the fact that it's a low volume house builder is probably the way, and I think we need more of them, I don't think the size of the builder is a planning reason for approval. And I think we kind of know that, much as we may wish it was in many ways. So it has to come back to the strategic gap. And the question I'm left is it's often talked about 1%, but I think that's looking at this gap in the wrong way. The gap has come up on the map. There'll be different parts of that area that are of differing value. And I'm sure, Councillor Hearn would be able to go through that and probably tell us which were the low value bits of that gap and which were the high. My concern is this is a high value bit of the strategic gap. So it's not just about the size and the 1%, it's about what function it actually currently performs in the gap for the community. Now, I think when you drive between Nailsea and Backwell, I can't picture that bit myself, but I am aware of it very much so from the Perrings, and it is quite an important part in terms of providing the vista out and that gap with Backwell. And that makes me think that actually it is an important piece of land in the gap. My final question I'm left with is where do you draw the line? This feels like boiling a frog to me. You can say, well, it's only 1% on the temperature, the frog will be fine. I've had 2 of my chickens die this week of heat exhaustion. Not that that's particularly relevant to this planning application, but it kind of makes you think, where is the line drawn? When will we say enough is enough, and why isn't it now? And I have to admit, I haven't got an answer to that question, and I don't know whether that's something maybe I've not picked up in the reports, maybe it's a technical aspect, but I would be very interested in when is enough enough? When do we draw that line? And is that something as a judgment that this committee would and should be making? And actually, if we are going to think about the strategic gap, the proper place to do that is not by incrementally taking off 1% here and there. debasing the coinage, so to speak, so as to call it if it was a coin, but it's actually part of the local plan and strategic local plan process. That is where we should be sitting and discussing this, and it may be that this plot is quite rightly part of future development as part of the local plan. But at the moment, I'm concerned that just chipping away at it is not really a very productive or effective way forward and sends the wrong message to our communities.
Thank you, Ashley. Councillor McQuillan.
Thank you, Chairman. And this is interesting and unfortunate, because having just worked closely with Councillor Cartman, I'm now going to take the opposite viewpoint. Unfortunately, I sympathise very much with those who've got concerns about this development. And as stated in the previous committee, I have, as Councillor Crawford-Hawley has outlined, grave concerns about the defensibility of any refusal on the grounds of strategic gap, seeing as our own policy experts have suggested it meets all three criteria. In every other aspect, as the ward member herself admits, it's a good development and it is down to the strategic gap. The strategic gap passes, in this application passes the test to the strategic gap in this particular case. And the other point to note is my understanding of planning policy, and I'm happy to be corrected by officers, is that each planning application is to be decided on its own merits, and that there are other places to discuss planning strategy and planning policy. So looking at this application in isolation and bearing in mind that it meets all the tests in our own policy, and it is, again, referring to something advised by officers from the previous meeting, the strategic gap is only in our policy. It doesn't have the national status that Greenbelt does, unfortunately. Then I don't believe that this is an appropriate reason for refusal. It's going to cause us problems in the future, and for that reason I do not support the motion, unfortunately.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to pass over now to Richard Kent.
Thanks, Chairman. I'll pass on to Roger as well to comment on details. I just wanted to pick up the issue about when is enough. And clearly the development plan, the local plan, is the way that we allocate housing sites, and that process, as you know, is kicking off for the next plan. The current plan, though, does allow for up to 50 houses on the edge of the town, subject to various criteria, and that's been assessed in the report. So our current plan does allow for this in principle, subject to the impact on the gap, which is where we've been discussing. And the test on the gap becomes important because of the 5-year supply shortfall. So you have to, it's not, you know, you're into shades of grey, but you have to be satisfied that the adverse impacts are so significant, they do outweigh the benefits of additional housing. I just thought I'd flag that point up, and let's just hand it on to Roger.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I think you've made the point that I was going to make, but if I could just comment on the point that was made about the value of this site in terms of the strategic gap. It's not the main part of the frontage where one gets an impression on the pairings of there being open land beyond and effectively separating Nailsea from the next settlement. This is for at least part of its length concealed behind existing development that fronts onto the pairings, and there is really a relatively small green frontage which is effectively to be lost. Part of that is also being retained as open space, but I think the key point here, as I say, is that there is existing frontage which conceals it, and in landscape terms it is quite a self-contained site which, although clearly in land use terms it does form part of the strategic gap, and it would have been formed part of the considerations of why it was included within the strategic gap. In landscape terms it's actually quite self-contained and not terribly visible in general terms from the sort of main routes, the pairings, and from sort of wider afield. There are clearly other parts of the strategic gap which are much more sort of visible and have that greater role in providing that separation between Nailsea and Backwell.
Thank you, Roger. Councillor Crew.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, very difficult to defend it based on the strategic gap. It's one of those things that you have to look at the size, you have to look at what the planning officers have said what we do. 1 minute we're saying our planning officers are right, the next minute we're saying we're not too sure. Chairman, if you look at this overall, if you look at the gaps in a lot of our villages now, they are much closer than this one. We don't know what's around the corner and what might come in the future. At the moment, a lot of that area cannot be built on and will not be. This is 14 and has been outlined. We've already agreed that we can extend up to 50 houses on the villages around there. So it does make sense to go ahead. But I would come back to the comment that was made by John and Ash's reply. If this was a major development, a major developer, we wouldn't be looking at 14 houses. They'd be trying to push for a lot more. The point of being a smaller developer is where we can get some sense and small developments on the edge of villages, and if we contain it with small developments like this, it's a win-win all the way around, Chairman. So I'm for the development.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Westwood.
Thank you, Chairman. So, yeah, 14 dwelling zoning in a little bijou development, and we're told that we can build up to 50 on the edge of, but outside a settlement boundary. This is different because, okay, this is outside the settlement boundary, but it's also, as we've acknowledged, within the strategic gap. So it's sort of, there's a sort of a double lock on it in many ways. And it has been pointed out that the land to the south is effectively sterilised from further development, certainly via the road, the turning head that's there. But just looking at the picture of the strategic gap that we saw, if you look to the east of this particular patch of land, just close to where the entrance or proposed entrance is going to come in, you've got a great big chunk there that's within the strategic gap. And, well, you know, we've heard our head of planning basically saying that we would just need to judge everything on each application. I must admit I'm very torn on this one, because if it's not defensible, and the answer is that it's not defensible, then really we should bite the bullet and vote for it. But we're always going to have to be, as Ashley said earlier on, you know, when is enough enough? And from listening to our officers, we are going to have to be very well, just keep an eye on every application that comes in, you know, to see if it can be, if it's within a strategic gap. Is that too much? Like I said, at the moment, the strategic gap is, or this particular strategic gap is pristine. It's not being gone into. My view, the idea of a strategic gap is in the title. It's there for a reason. It wouldn't be called a strategic gap if it wasn't. This one's untouched at the moment, and you know, you can't be only a little bit pregnant, can you? There you go. Anyway.
Thank you, Richard. Roger, I think you want to step in at this point, don't you?
Thank you, Chairman. Just to perhaps remind members, in terms of the strategic gap, that's obviously shown on here. The other sort of critical point between Nailsea and Backwell is over to the east here, but that enjoys greenbelt protection. The Town Council currently has an application pending for village green status on this land, which effectively covers the majority of that remaining road frontage there, from which appreciation of the strategic gap can be obtained. Just to sort of, I suppose, reinforce that point, on the site's allocations plan, the area that's got the cross-hatching here is also defined as proposed local amenity space as well. So there are various designations which I think would provide some protection to that strategic gap. And as I say, that road frontage there will remain. It's really a very small percentage of it that's actually affected in this vicinity here.
Thank you, Roger. Councillor Bird.
Just to say and ask a question is, we have a strategic gap. What is a strategic gap for? To be a strategic gap. If we're taking bits away from it and reducing it, it's less of a strategic gap. So I can't understand why we're thinking about actually reducing a strategic gap. It's also, as said, it's outside the settlement boundary. That's two reasons. Yeah, just to sum up with that, I agree exactly with what Ash said earlier and all he said.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any other speakers? Oh, do you want to use this as part of the summing up, or?
I'll leave Sandra to sum up. Just want 2 quick points.
Thank you.
I believe Persimmon Homes have lodged an objection to the proposed Tyne Green, which is interesting. And also, just to add, for many years, the Town Council and all the local councillors have campaigned for this land to be reclassified as Green Belt. And the Town Council have still aspirations to have this land transferred to Green Belt because of the serious threat of housing development. It's a slippery slope, Chairman.
Thank you, Andy. Right, Sandra, would you like to sum up, please?
Yeah, as I said, I originally brought this in April, and there were a lot more problems which are on this application. We are now just left with this one, because even earlier this week, the developers and the officers were talking and trying to resolve those issues, which I believe they have done, as we said. So we are now just stuck with this proposed development lying within the strategic gap, where it would harm the open and undeveloped character of the area, resulting in incremental erosion of the gap, separating Nailsea and Backwell and the landscape setting of Nailsea, contrary to policy CS19 of the core strategy and policy SA7 of the site allocation plan.
Thank you, Sandra. Right, the proposal is to go against officer recommendation and to refuse the application for the reasons that Sandra has just given. We will now go to the vote. All those in favour of the proposal? Those against?
Would you mind, Chairman, if we put the hands up high just to clarify that?
Okay, can we go back to those for the application?
Is this for the proposal by Councillor Hunt? So this is
proposal for refusal
for
of
refusal.
the application.
Thank you.
Yeah. 4, okay. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, that motion is lost. Who would like to put a further motion forwards? Councillor Crawford.
Substantive motion for approval as recommended by the officers.
Right. Does that find a second? Thank you, Councillor Crew. All those in favour of approval of the application? 2, 3, 4, 5. Against? 3. That's carried. Thank you very much. Right. Agenda item 8. I will invite Richard Kent to cover this report. Thank you, Richard.
Chairman, thank you. Just very briefly, you'll see we've had a good appeal result on an enforcement appeal for Coles Garage at Red Hill. You'll also see that we do have a string of enforcement appeals in front of us. So again, as I said at the previous meeting, in the meeting before that, the enforcement team is exceptionally busy issuing notices, but then having to deal with the outfall, which is the inevitable appeal. The other one, just to flag up, as I'm sure you're aware, the Bristol Airport inquiry started on Tuesday, yesterday. So we've just been through day 2. During this week, we've taken opening submissions from all the parties, the council, the appellants, and the Rule 6 parties. And then today, it was the turn for the Parish Councils Airport Association to bring their evidence, or some of their evidence, and then for the inspectors to hear comments from some of the local residents and others. It's been so far so good in terms of the arrangements. Obviously, there was a little bit of public interest outside the building, but that was well managed. And also, thanks to Mike and Co in the corner, the technology has worked very well. So you'll recall it's a blended event. So we've got inspectors and people in this room. We've got other people participating via Microsoft Teams on these screens. And a bit like rubbing your head and doing your tummy, it's also on YouTube. So people can watch there. And it's a huge effort by the IT guys. And thank you to them for doing that. And battle begins in earnest next week.
Thank you for that, Roger. Richard. I'll get it right in a minute. Agenda item 9, urgent business permitted by Local Government Act 1972.
There is none, Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you all very much for your attendance on this stifling afternoon, and I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.